In the crisp autumn of 1995, Robert Maxwell, a night shift security guard at Northgate International Airport, vanished into the ether of humming fluorescent lights and the distant roar of jet engines. One moment he was there, a steady, unassuming presence, making his rounds through the labyrinthine service corridors of Terminal C. The next he was gone. He was a man of simple habits and simpler pleasures, a 48-year-old husband and father who preferred rolled cigarettes to store-bought and the quiet solitude of his post to the clamor of the main concourse. His disappearance was a clean break, a tear in the fabric of his mundane life that left no threads to follow. The initial investigation was a flurry of activity that quickly settled into a fog of confusion. Detectives scoured the sprawling airport grounds, interviewed his weary-eyed colleagues, and picked apart his life with the meticulous, impersonal curiosity of their trade. They found nothing. His locker was untouched, his beat-up Ford sedan was in its designated spot in the employee lot, and his last paycheck was waiting for him at home. The official narrative began to write itself, shaped by the absence of evidence. Robert Maxwell, they theorized, must have simply walked away. Perhaps he was crushed by unseen debts, or perhaps he harbored a secret life that had finally called him away. It was a neater conclusion than the void of the unknown, a story that allowed the case file to be stamped cold and placed in a dusty archive box. His wife, Sarah, never believed it. She knew the man who came home every morning smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the man whose greatest ambition was to see his daughter graduate from college. He wasn't a man who ran. He was a man who stood his ground. For 9 years, her belief was a silent, lonely vigil against a world that had moved on. The airport expanded, new terminals rose from the concrete, and the name Robert Maxwell became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered among new recruits. But 9 years later, in the summer of 2004, a construction crew was tasked with a renovation project in the oldest section of Terminal C, the very same wing where Robert had last been seen. Their job was to tear down walls, to gut the old and make way for the new. It was loud, dusty, thankless work. A foreman named Carlos, a man whose hands were calloused from 2 decades of demolition, swung his sledgehammer against a stretch of drywall in a forgotten service hallway. The wall wasn't on the original blueprints, an oddity the site supervisor had dismissed as a shoddy, undocumented repair from years ago. The third swing of the hammer didn't meet the expected resistance. Instead, it punched through with a hollow thud, releasing a puff of stale, ancient air that smelled of dust and decay. Carlos peered into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. It wasn't a utility chase or insulation. It was a room, a small, cramped space, no bigger than a closet, that had been deliberately sealed off from the world. The beam of light danced across the floor, illuminating a weathered leather suitcase, coated in a thick, gray shroud of dust. And next to it, something that made Carlos's blood run cold. The skeletal remains of a human hand, the bone stark white against the grimy floor, still draped in the tattered cuff of a security guard's uniform. The police were called, and with them, the ghosts of a long-forgotten case were wrenched back into the harsh light of the present. The discovery ripped through the quiet hum of the Northgate Police Department's cold case unit like a lightning strike. For Detective James Corbin, the news was more than just another assignment. It was a specter from his own past. As a rookie patrolman in 1995, he had been one of the dozens of uniformed officers who had walked the perimeter of the airport in a fruitless grid search for Robert Maxwell. The case had been his first real taste of a true mystery, of a life erased without a trace, and its unanswered questions had burrowed deep into his professional consciousness. Now, nearly a decade later, with more years and more ghosts behind him, the case was his. He arrived at the scene, pushing past the yellow tape that cordoned off the service corridor. The air was thick with the scent of disturbed dust and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet that spoke of forensic chemicals. The renovation work had ceased, the corridor now a silent, sterile theater of investigation. Corbin ducked under the tape and stepped into the space, his eyes immediately drawn to the jagged hole in the wall. The forensics team, clad in white Tyvek suits, moved with a quiet, practiced grace around the makeshift tomb. He crouched down, his gaze taking in the scene with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The remains, now partially uncovered, were clearly those of a man in a security uniform. The leather suitcase sat beside him like a loyal, waiting dog. But it was a small object, glinting under the harsh work lights, that seized Corbin's full attention. Lying just inches from the skeletal fingers was a polished silver cigar cutter. It was elegant, expensive, and completely out of place. Corbin remembered the details from the original file. Robert Maxwell was a working man, a simple man. His one vice was hand-rolled cigarettes made with cheap, pungent tobacco. He was not a man who would own a custom-engraved cigar cutter. This was the anomaly. This was the piece that didn't fit the puzzle of a man who simply walked away from his life. This was the first real clue in 9 years. He felt a familiar thrum of intuition, a gut feeling that had served him better than hard evidence on more than one occasion. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a message, left behind by a killer who had grown arrogant, careless. The lead forensic examiner, a woman named Dr. Evans, approached him, her voice low. He was killed by a single, powerful blow to the back of the head, Jim, then placed in here. The wall was built to hide him. Drywall, studs, the whole 9 yards. This wasn't a place he crawled into to die. He was entombed. Corbin nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the cigar cutter. The official narrative, the comforting lie that had allowed a case to go cold, had just been shattered. Robert Maxwell didn't run. He was executed. His final resting place a custom-built crypt hidden in the belly of the very place he had been paid to protect. The investigation was no longer cold, it was burning. The first step was the one he dreaded most. Informing the next of kin is a duty that never gets easier, a transfer of pain that leaves a residue on the soul. He found Sarah Maxwell living in the same modest suburban house she had shared with Robert, a home frozen in time, filled with the ghosts of a life that had been violently interrupted. She was older now, her face a road map of grief and 9 long years of unanswered questions. When Corbin gently explained what had been found, she didn't weep. Instead, a profound, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, the sound of a burden finally being set down, even if its weight was being replaced by the sharp certainty of loss. "I knew it," she whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched a faded photograph of her husband. "He would never have left us. Not Bobby." Corbin sat with her for over an hour, his question soft, his presence a somber anchor in her storm of renewed grief. He asked about the cigar cutter. Sarah shook her head instantly. No, never. He hated the smell of cigars. Said they were for rich men with too much time and money. She then confirmed what had only been a footnote in the original file. A few weeks before he disappeared, Robert had been agitated, losing sleep. He had mentioned something about his night shifts, about seeing things he wasn't supposed to see. He talked about night shipments, Sarah recalled, her eyes distant. In Terminal C, cargo that moved too fast, too quietly. He said the paperwork didn't look right. I told him to leave it alone, to not go looking for trouble. He was too honest, detective. I think that's what got him killed. Corbin left Sarah's house with a grim sense of purpose. Her words had given a voice to his intuition. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a professional hit, a silencing. Back at the station, the fluorescent lights hummed over a mountain of resurrected files. Corbin and his small team began the arduous task of rebuilding the world of Northgate International Airport as it had existed in 1995. They pulled employee records, security manifests, construction permits, and access logs. They were looking for a ghost, a figure with the authority and access to not only kill a man, but to orchestrate the construction of his tomb within a secure federal facility. Names and faces from the past flickered across the screen, a roster of pilots, baggage handlers, and administrators. One name appeared with increasing frequency in positions of rising authority: Arthur Vance. In 1995, Vance was an ambitious, fast-track junior executive in the airport's operations division. Today, in 2004, he was the head of airport operations, a celebrated civic leader, a philanthropist whose name was on art gallery wings and charity fundraiser invitations. He was the polished, public face of Northgate International, a man universally described as brilliant, charming, and untouchable. He was also, Corbin discovered, the man whose division had overseen all non-aviation maintenance and construction in Terminal C during that fateful autumn. Corbin scheduled an interview, framing it as a procedural formality, a chance for the airport's current leadership to assist in a historical case. He needed to see the man, to take his measure, to look into the eyes of the person who, in 1995, had the power to make a wall and a man disappear. The intuition in his gut was no longer a hum. It was a siren. Arthur Vance's office was on the top floor of the new administrative tower, a glass-walled perch that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the runways below. The room was a monument to success, tastefully decorated with modern art, rich mahogany, and the faint, pleasant aroma of expensive leather and cedar. Vance himself was the centerpiece. He rose to greet Corbin with a politician's smile, his handshake firm, his suit impeccably tailored. He was in his late 50s, with a mane of silver hair and eyes that were a placid, intelligent blue. He was the very picture of control and respectability. "Detective Corbin," he began, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. "A terrible business, this. Truly shocking. I was just a junior manager back then, but I remember the news about Mr. Maxwell. A tragedy. Please have a seat. Anything I can do, any resources you need, they're yours." He was a master of disarming charm. For the next hour, Vance was the perfect witness, helpful, concerned, and authoritative. He spoke of the airport's evolution, the security protocols of the mid-90s versus the post-9/11 era, and the difficulty of keeping track of every corner of such a vast facility. When Corbin steered the conversation toward the specific service corridor in Terminal C, Vance's expression was one of thoughtful recollection. "Ah, yes, the old C-wing corridors," he said, leaning back in his chair. "A veritable maze. Most of that area was scheduled for asbestos abatement and eventual demolition even back then. We were constantly dealing with undocumented maintenance work from the 70s. A structural Wild West, you might say." He offered to pull the original blueprints for Corbin, a gesture of transparent helpfulness. He seemed to have an answer for everything, his narrative seamless and logical. He was the hidden in plain sight villain, cloaked not in shadows, but in the blinding glare of public esteem. Corbin listened, nodding, playing the role of the diligent, but slightly overwhelmed detective. He was watching Vance's hands, his posture, the subtle tells that a man like Vance believed no one was smart enough to notice. As the interview wound down, Corbin asked one last, seemingly innocuous question about airport culture back then. As Vance formulated his answer, his right hand drifted unconsciously toward a handsome humidor on the corner of his desk. His fingers brushed the polished lid, a gesture of familiarity, of ownership, before he pulled his hand back, as if realizing the impropriety of considering a cigar while discussing a man's death. It was a flicker, a momentary lapse in his curated performance. But for Corbin, it was a flare in the darkness. He had seen enough. Leaving the office, walking back through the gleaming, impersonal halls of Vance's empire, Corbin felt a cold certainty crystallize within him. He didn't just suspect Arthur Vance, he knew. The man's performance had been too perfect, his explanations too neat. He was a predator hiding behind a mask of civic duty. The intuitive siren in Corbin's mind was now screaming, and he knew his investigation had to move from the overt to the clandestine. He had to dismantle this man's world, piece by painstaking piece, before Vance even knew he was under attack. The hunt had begun. The first order of business for Corbin was to chase the anomaly, the silver cigar cutter. It felt less like a piece of evidence and more like a calling card, an arrogant mistake left at the scene. He sent detailed photographs to high-end jewelers and tobacconists across the country. The design was unique, featuring a small, stylized eagle's head etched into the handle. It was the kind of bespoke item made for a man who appreciated the finer, more ruthless things in life. While he waited for a response, he dove into the records Vance had so helpfully offered to provide. The blueprints for Terminal C arrived, pristine and official-looking. But Corbin, trusting his gut, also sourced a second, older set from the city's dusty municipal archives. Comparing them side by side, he found the discrepancy. On the archived city plans, the service corridor was a simple, unbroken hallway. On the set from Vance's office, the wall was present, marked with a faint annotation, "Acoustic paneling upgrade October 95. The unveiling had begun. The date, October 1995, was just days after Robert Maxwell disappeared. Corbin's team dug deeper, pulling the specific construction manifests for that project. The work order was for an emergency sound dampening installation, an absurd justification for a rarely used basement corridor. The contractor listed, Keystone Solutions, was a ghost. The company had been incorporated 2 months before the job and had dissolved 1 month after. Its address, a rented post office box. The entire operation was a fiction, a paper trail created to legitimize the construction of a tomb. The work order had been signed off by a low-level maintenance supervisor who had retired and moved to Florida a year later, conveniently beyond easy reach. But the authorizing signature, the one that approved the emergency expenditure, belonged to his direct superior, Arthur Vance. The pieces were beginning to slam into place, forming a picture of cold, calculated conspiracy. Corbin's intuition led him next to the human element. Who else from that era might have seen something? He cross-referenced customs agent rosters with Vance's operational timeline, searching for anyone who might have noticed irregularities. He found name David Chun, a retired customs officer who had a reputation for being a bulldog. Corbin found him running a quiet fishing charter business, his face weathered by the sun and sea. At first, Chun was reluctant to talk, the memories of old bureaucracy leaving a sour taste. But when Corbin mentioned Arthur Vance and the night shipments, Chen's eyes narrowed. "Vance," he spat, the name like an epithet. "Mr. Teflon. We always had suspicions. We'd get intel about a hot container, something coming in from Asia. High-end electronics, they said. But every time we'd try to flag it for a secondary inspection, it would get a green light from on high. The paperwork was always perfect, the seals intact. And the directive to clear it always came from operations. It came from Vance's office." Chun described a slick, seamless operation. The smuggled goods were likely hidden within legitimate shipments, moved off the tarmac during the graveyard shift when staffing was low, and spirited away before the morning sun hit the concrete. It was an enterprise that required absolute control over security, logistics, and personnel. Control that only one man possessed. Robert Maxwell, the honest guard walking his quiet beat, must have seen something he shouldn't have. A broken seal, a doctored manifest, a truck in the wrong place at the wrong time. He would have been the single grain of sand in Vance's well-oiled machine. Just as Corbin was piecing this together, the call came in from a jeweler in New York. He recognized the eagle head etching on the cigar cutter. It was the signature mark of a custom craftsman he knew. The piece was one of a limited run of 50, made for a list of very wealthy, very private clients in the early 90s. The jeweler agreed to discreetly check the original sales ledger. The name he found sent a jolt of electricity through Corbin, Arthur Vance. The noose was tightening. Corbin now possessed a powerful chain of circumstantial evidence. He had the motive. Robert Maxwell had discovered Vance's high-stakes smuggling ring. He had the means and opportunity. Vance controlled the airport's operations and had commissioned the construction of the hidden wall. And now, he had the murder weapon's potential accessory, the custom-made cigar cutter, a direct physical link between the opulent world of Arthur Vance and the dusty tomb of Bob Maxwell. But circumstantial evidence, however strong, could be argued away by a high-priced legal team. Vance was a master of plausible deniability. Corbin needed something more, something irrefutable. His focus turned back to the crime scene, to the other object left with the body, the weathered leather suitcase. The forensics team had been working on it for weeks, its contents a fragile, almost fossilized mass of shredded paper. Dr. Evans and her team had been painstakingly trying to reassemble the confetti, a task akin to solving a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with no picture on the box. Corbin went down to the lab, the air sharp with the smell of archival chemicals. Evans led him to a large light table where fragments of paper were laid out like surgical specimens. "We're getting somewhere," she said, her voice tired but tinged with excitement. Whoever shredded this did a thorough job, but they used a standard office shredder from that era. The strips are uniform. We've been able to piece together several sections. She pointed to a newly reconstructed document. Even in its fragmented state, the nature of it was clear. It was a shipping manifest, an internal logistics form. The document detailed a shipment of computer monitors from Taiwan. But next to the official weight and volume were handwritten annotations in small, neat block letters. Different weights, different product codes for items like microprocessors and memory modules, far more valuable and compact than monitors. It was the proof. This was what Robert Maxwell had collected. He hadn't just stumbled upon the operation. He had been documenting it, building a case of his own. He had likely confronted his killer with this suitcase full of evidence, sealing his own fate. The final, damning piece of the puzzle lay on a separate tray under a magnifying lamp. "We got one more thing," Dr. Evans said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "From the cigar cutter. It was protected from the elements, lying face down in the dust. We lifted a partial fingerprint from the silver casing." Corbin's heart hammered against his ribs. "Did you run it?" "First thing we did," she confirmed. "It's not in AFIS or any other criminal database. The print belongs to someone who has never been arrested. Someone with a clean record." The path forward was now dangerously clear. Corbin had to get a fresh fingerprint from Arthur Vance. A surreptitious recovery, like lifting a print from his office, was too risky. Vance was meticulous and would have his office professionally cleaned. Corbin needed to get the man into his own territory, an environment he controlled, and compel him to leave his mark. He would set a trap, using the law itself as bait. He picked up the phone and dialed his sergeant. "I need you to schedule a follow-up interview with Arthur Vance," he said, his voice steady and cold. "Here, at the station. Tell him we need him to come in to sign a formal witness statement to close out our internal report on his cooperation. Make it sound like pure bureaucracy. The final piece of paperwork before we move on." The trap was being laid, baited with the one thing Vance would never be able to resist: the belief in his own untouchable superiority. The interrogation room was a deliberate choice. It was small, windowless, and painted a soul-crushing shade of institutional beige. The air was stale, a stark contrast to the breezy, panoramic view from Arthur Vance's office. This was Corbin's world, a place stripped of power suits and pretense, where truth was extracted under the unforgiving glare of a single fluorescent light. Vance arrived looking slightly irritated, as if the summons was a tedious imposition on his valuable time. He was still the picture of tailored elegance, but in this sterile box, he looked less like a captain of industry and more like a man in a very expensive cage. "Detective," he said, his smile a little tighter than before. "I trust we can make this quick. I have a luncheon with the mayor." Corbin gestured to the chair opposite him. "Just a formality, Mr. Vance. We appreciate you coming down." The interview began just as the first one had, with Corbin asking routine questions, his tone deferential. He walked Vance through his original statement, having him confirm dates and job titles. Vance relaxed visibly, his posture loosening, his answers smooth and practiced. He was on comfortable ground, reciting a script he had perfected in his own mind. Then Corbin began to deviate. "The construction company we discussed, Keystone Solutions," he said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "We can't find any record of their state business license or their tax filings. It's like they never existed." Vance's eyes, for the first time, lost a fraction of their placid calm. "As I said, detective, it was a different time. A lot of smaller. Contractors operated less formally." "And the work order," Corbin continued, sliding a copy across the metal table, "for the acoustic paneling. That's your signature authorizing the payment, is it not?" Vance glanced at the paper, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His knuckles, resting on the table, had turned white. It appears to be. I signed hundreds of such authorizations a month. It was part of my job. The room grew quiet. The hum of the lights seemed to amplify. Corbin leaned forward. The performance was over. It's a hot day, Corbin said casually, changing the subject abruptly. He rose and walked to a small water cooler in the corner. Can I get you a glass of water, Mr. Vance? Vance, momentarily thrown by the shift in tone, hesitated before giving a curt nod. Thank you. Corbin poured a glass of water from the cooler and placed it on the table in front of Vance. The trap was now set. The next move was his. Vance, seeking to reclaim his composure, picked up the glass and took a long, slow drink, his eyes never leaving Corbin's. He set the glass down deliberately on the table, leaving a perfect ring of condensation on the metal surface. It was done. Corbin concluded the interview a few minutes later, thanking Vance for his time. As soon as Vance was escorted from the building, a forensics technician swept into the room, carefully bagging the glass. The wait was agonizing. Corbin paced his small office, the reconstructed manifests, and the photo of the cigar cutter laid out on his desk like tarot cards spelling out a grim fate. An hour later, the lab called. The print lifted from the water glass was a perfect, undeniable match to the latent print found on the silver cigar cutter from a tomb. Corbin took a deep breath, the air feeling clean and sharp in his lungs for the first time all day. He looked at his sergeant. Get a warrant for his arrest and bring him back in. The real interview is about to begin. When Arthur Vance was brought back into the same interrogation room less than 2 hours later, he was a changed man. The tailored suit was now slightly rumpled, the confident charm replaced by a mask of cold fury. He was flanked by a lawyer who looked expensive and predatory, but Corbin directed the officers to place Vance in the room alone first. He wanted a few minutes without the legal buffer. Corbin walked in and closed the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing in the tense silence. He didn't sit down. He stood over Vance, a looming presence of implacable justice. He slid 2 evidence bags onto the table. One contained the silver cigar cutter. The other contained a high-resolution photograph of the fingerprint lifted from it. We found your fingerprint, Arthur, Corbin said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. On the cigar cutter. The one you dropped when you sealed Bob Maxwell in his tomb 9 years ago. It's a perfect match to the print you left on the water glass a few hours ago. For a long moment, Vance just stared at the bags. The muscles in his jaw worked silently. The entire edifice of his life, the carefully constructed facade of respectability and power, was crumbling around him. Any other man would have shouted, denied, or broken down. Vance did something far more chilling. A slow, thin smile spread across his lips, a horrifying crack in his composure that revealed the monster beneath. A cigar cutter, he mused, his voice a low, clinical whisper. Such a small thing. A moment of carelessness in an otherwise flawless execution. This was it, the confession. It wasn't coerced or tearful. It was a boast. He was an insignificant man, Vance continued, his eyes locking with Corbin's, a strange, triumphant light in them. A nobody. But he was a problem. He had a Boy Scout's conscience, and he just couldn't leave well enough alone. He saw one of my men supervising a container swap. He got curious. Started copying manifests from the depot office. He put it all in that ridiculous little suitcase. Vance recounted the night of the murder with a detached, remorseless clarity that made the hair on Corbin's arms stand up. He described luring Maxwell into the deserted corridor under the pretense of inspecting a security breach. He spoke of the confrontation, how Maxwell, clutching his suitcase, had threatened to go to the federal authorities. He was noble, Vance said with a sneer, and naive. He thought his little file of papers could bring down an operation that was making men like me untouchable. I explained his options. He could take a handsome retirement and forget everything he saw, or he could be a hero. He chose to be a hero. Vance described the single, swift blow with a heavy wrench he'd brought with him. He spoke of the prepaid construction crew that arrived an hour later, a team of illegal workers who asked no questions as they erected a wall, sealing Robert Maxwell and his suitcase of evidence away from the world. It was perfect, Vance said, his smile widening. The audacity of it. Hiding him in the one place no one would ever think to look. Right under their noses. My monument to his stupidity. He showed no remorse, no flicker of humanity. His only emotion was a profound narcissistic annoyance that he had been caught, not by a worthy adversary, but by a plotting detective, and his own sentimental attachment to a trinket. His motivation, he confessed, was never just about the money. It was about the power, the thrill of subverting the system he was meant to uphold, the godlike control of moving unseen forces while the world saw only the philanthropist. The confession was a glimpse into the abyss, a portrait of a man utterly devoid of a soul. The arrest of Arthur Vance sent a seismic shockwave through the city. The story was a media supernova. The celebrated philanthropist, the captain of industry, the face of the city's progress, was a cold-blooded killer and the architect of a massive, smuggling empire. His fall from grace was as spectacular as his rise had been. The trial was brief. Faced with the irrefutable fingerprint evidence and his own chilling, recorded confession, Vance's expensive legal team could do little more than posture. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and a litany of federal charges. The mask of respectability was permanently stripped away, revealing the remorseless predator beneath. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his final destination a concrete cell, a tomb of his own making. A few weeks after the sentencing, Detective Corbin drove back to the quiet, suburban house where Sarah Maxwell lived. He found her tending to the small garden in her front yard, the lines of grief on her face now softened with a measure of peace. He carried a small, manila envelope in his hand. "This is for you," he said gently, handing it to her. Inside was a small, plastic evidence bag. Within the bag was a worn leather wallet, and inside the wallet was a faded, creased photograph of a young Sarah, smiling, captured in a moment of pure joy from decades ago. It was the one personal item of Robert's that had survived its long entombment, a final, silent message of love that had outlasted his killer's hate. Sarah clutched the photograph to her chest, and this time she wept. They were tears not of pure sorrow, but of painful, cathartic release. Justice had been served. The void of the unknown had been filled with a terrible truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. The man she loved had not abandoned her. He had been stolen from her. And now his name was cleared, his memory honored. As Corbin drove away, he took a route that led him past the airport. It was night, and the sprawling complex was a galaxy of twinkling lights, a city unto itself, full of purpose and motion. It looked the same as it always had, a symbol of connection and departure. But for Corbin, it was different now. It was no longer a place that held a dark, unresolved secret. A ghost had been laid to rest. The resolution wasn't a happy one. It couldn't erase the 9 years of pain or bring a good man back. But it was a testament to the stubborn persistence of truth, a confirmation that no matter how deep something is buried, or how high a wall is built to conceal it, a single crack of light is all it takes to bring everything into the open.